My name is Richard Pops. I'm the CEO of a company called Alkermes. This panel has a fairly innocuous title, which is something like the promise of science in the pipeline. It takes an ecosystem, which basically is an empty set we can fill with whatever we want to fill. I am actually thrilled about this panel because, not to disparage any other panel that's happening concurrently, but this will by far be the best panel of the day. And I can say that with confidence because in preparing for this panel, typically, because we all often are on panels, we'll go and we'll have a single conference call and people will say, okay, we'll just kind of do the usual things that we do. But this is an unusual amalgamation of people, and we all didn't know each other. We all kind of know subsets of each other. And so what I decided to do is just have an individual conversation with each of the panelists, and there's 6 of them, as you can count. And I got to tell you, each of those conversations was about a half hour, 45 minutes, and they were fascinating. And so 6 times 30 minutes is 3 hours of discussion. We don't have 3 hours, we have an hour and a half, but it just tells me how fast we could fill this topic, because I would say that for me, having been the CEO of our company for over 20 years, I am embarrassed to admit, the most dynamic and exciting thing that's happening in our business of developing new medicines is the ascendance of the voice of the patient and the sophisticated patient advocacy group that echoes or amplifies that voice. And the nature of that interaction between drug developers and the patient groups is the new dynamic. And I don't think a lot of people in our industry completely clock that yet. And so the purpose of this panel, for those of you in the room and the people on the web, and hopefully if we archive it and make any progress, is in some ways to excite you about the way the dynamic is changing, and maybe even make you a little uncomfortable. Because the thesis I have is that if you're running a biopharmaceutical company, or if you're sitting at the FDA, or any place of putative control, I think it's time to shatter the illusion that you're in control of what you're doing right now. I think this is a far more dynamic ecosystem, and I think different voices have just as much weight as yours. And if you think you're going to develop your drugs the way you think you're going to develop them, improve them and regulate them the way you think they're going to be approved and regulated, I think you have another thing coming. So that's the provocative statement that's going to kind of inform the discussion that we're going to have. And there are people with no shortage of educated and strong points of view about that on the panel. So what I thought I would do is ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves. And we have a little bit of time, so let's not ramble too long, but just more than name, rank, serial number, maybe just a second on what your organization does and a little bit about yourself. And then we'll level set everybody, then we'll kick it off. Why don't you go ahead, Mark?
Absolutely. So I am Margaret Anderson, and I'm in a very familiar place at the front with my name starting with A, and I told Chris my A beats his A. As a kid, I was always in the first chair, so this feels familiar with you in the teacher seat too. I had a not-for-profit that's based here in Washington, and it's called FasterCures. We're a center of the Milken Institute, which is based primarily in Santa Monica. And our job is to try to look across the medical research system at what things are slowing us down. So I'm excited today to talk about the role, as you've talked about, some of the kind of patient engagement, patient power, kind of things that we've all witnessed, and hopefully to whet your appetite to think about a bit of a reframe of that notion. I have many thoughts that I've accumulated even in the past couple of weeks of how we are viewing the patient, and I think that we all would stand to benefit from a bit of a reframe of that.
Perfect. Chris?
So I'm Chris Austin. I'm the director of the National Center for Advancing Translational Sciences at NIH. Our job, put simply, is to catalyze more medicines getting to more patients more quickly. And we do this by being a catalyst to move those processes forward, to allow partners to work with each other. We look on translation as a scientific and an organizational problem, and we study it as such. We work in everything from target validation through implementation science in the clinic. Just to give you a little bit about my background, I actually am a neurologist and a geneticist, so I trained at both ends of the spectrum, and then I went to Merck for a while and learned how to do drugs there, and then
Develop drugs.
developed
Did
drugs.
drugs. But Chris did drugs.
and learn, how empirical this process is, and it's not just true in drug development; it's true in the more later stages of translation. So we have the incredible privilege of not having a short-term commercial imperative. So we are able to work with partners from the public sector and the private sector and the foundation sector to work on the general problems which bedevil the increasing efficiency in this space.
Good morning. I'm Jonathan Leff. I'm with Deerfield Management. We are an investment firm, and my focus is on venture capital investments in biotech and pharma companies. The firm itself invests in all things healthcare, and we have folks focused, in addition to biotech and pharma, also on medical devices and healthcare services. So really anything that we see as advancing healthcare, improving healthcare through better products, better technologies, and better ways of delivering is a candidate for us to invest in. We are, though, an investment fund, and our focus in that respect is on investing in healthcare as a means of returning attractive returns to our investors, and that informs a lot of the perspective that I bring to a panel like this when we talk about where does the money come from that funds innovations after they move out of the realm of government funding and NIH, where almost all of these innovations get their start, but then how do they make their way through the research and development pipeline and get to the marketplace? In addition to my role at Deerfield, I serve on the board of the National Venture Capital Association and chair that group's life sciences industry effort. So I have sort of a bird's eye view of what's happening in the venture community and some of the pressures that are faced, as well as the opportunities in terms of bringing capital to bear to translate science into medicine.
Good morning, and thank you for having me here. I'm Wendy Selig, and I'm the president and CEO of an organization called the Melanoma Research Alliance. So we are an example of all the incredible things that FasterCures has preached, and more than just an example, we're actually affiliated with the Milken Institute, and we're incubated by FasterCures and the team at the Milken Institute. Our mission is to defeat melanoma. We put all of our chips, if you will, all of our financial resources into funding translational research. And we are sort of, going back to what Richard said at the beginning, I think a very proud member of this sort of new universe and new model of patient organizations, patient-founded, patient-led, driven for the patient, but really a sophisticated research partner and collaborator with all the stakeholders, from other organizations in our foundation space to our friends in government, to the financial industry and investors, and to industry, who we view as a very, very important partner. We're focused on melanoma, but very quickly we'll say that we think much of what is happening in melanoma is applicable and relevant across oncology and perhaps beyond oncology and into other diseases. So we're very interested in sharing benefit from what we're learning in melanoma and what others are learning in other diseases. Just one anecdote, which is the first immunotherapy to come to market, which happens to be an incredible game changer for metastatic melanoma patients, was initially developed for prostate cancer and is now potentially setting the stage for cancers across the board. So, I think we're moving to a world where the traditional patient advocacy organization that is defined only by one disease state is becoming a thing of the past, and I'm excited to talk about that.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm Daniel Tassay. I am the CEO of Icaria. We're a company that specializes in developing drugs and drug device combinations for patients who are acutely ill. And we just split our business in two to help us best realize the science that we have, make it more likely we can take it to patients. And we chose to do that both as best scientific management of the risk as well as financial risk management. And when Richard called me and we started talking about the voice of patients, it drove home to me how, as we chose to do that as the best way to help us be successful in helping patients, what is now our outpatient business are patients who are very ill with advanced disease, and our ability to fold their voice into the development of product is critical, because quality of life and just the reality of what they have to go through. Part of the input to a clinical program is observing patients taking a shower and what position they sleep in bed, because it becomes important that we fold that into the voice of the patient. But then I have patients who are hospitalized in the other business, who are anesthetized and intubated, and they can't speak for themselves, somebody has to speak for them. So there's a voice for those patients also that just needs to be captured differently. But all that being said, that's the result of the fact that I think as a society, our ability to now invent new medicines and new therapies is probably better than ever. And the problems we have to tackle are good problems to have, because we're trying to essentially solve problems that 2 years, 5 years, or 10 years ago were not even on the table. So.
Thanks very much. I'm Sharon Terry, and I'm the president and CEO of Genetic Alliance. Genetic Alliance is a nonprofit that's about 28 years old this year, working to really empower individuals, families, and communities to transform health. And we do that largely through looking at things on a systems level and building cross-disease infrastructure. We've run registries and biobanks, for example, for about 11 years. I come to this because I'm a mom of 2 kids who were diagnosed in 1994 with a genetic condition, and I established a foundation for their disease, but very quickly discovered, even in the first few months, that working for one disease would never make a difference, and so since about 1995 have worked on things on a much broader level. And remember that, and Richard, it's interesting that you teed us off with the idea that there's a real rise in patient voice, and I have a poignant memory of this hotel 19 years ago. Our foundation was brand new. I came to it as a college chaplain, a former nun, and said, why are we sitting here listening to pharmaceutical companies and NIH speak? Why don't we do the research? Why don't we run the game? And did I get literally booed out of the room and put in the hallway? It was remarkable by my peers, then peers. So I think we have come an enormous distance where we can sit here today and talk about solutions and structures and commonalities between diseases and the game that needs to be played with all the stakeholders.
Fantastic. I mean, you can get a sense of the distribution of experiences and quality. And let me just give you a couple personal perspectives in my conversations. First of all, to give Margaret credit, it was really your meeting, the FasterCures meeting last spring or last fall? That it was really the first immersion that I had in this accelerated world of patient involvement. And what they do is they bring together academia and government and patients and companies and everybody for the purpose of FasterCures, and it's incredibly invigorating. And in many ways, it really piqued my interest in this whole domain. Chris, I didn't know, we had just talked on the telephone, so Harvard-trained, MGH, Princeton, all these things that scar you for the rest of your lives. But interesting, you've seen the arrogance of both academia and pharma.
Yep.
And both, and I mean that in a loving way. But then trying to create something within government that can interact with all of those. It's fascinating. Jonathan and I have known it a long time. We also serve together on the bio board, specifically in the regulatory environment committee that is focused on FDA. And in addition to the litany of things that Jonathan mentioned that he's involved in, he also has, which is unusual for venture capitalists, a deep relationship with some of the senior people within FDA. And that perspective for the regulators to also understand what the real world constraints are of companies that are trying to develop new medicines is a very valuable insight. Wendy, I didn't know either, and I mean, I keep quoting our conversation because I'll ask you to tell the anecdote about you guys going to ASCO and developing information on data about products that are being developed and interacting with the regulatory authority. I won't steal the thunder on that, but it's just eye-opening. I think, to me, it's the natural extension of what's happening. As patient advocacy groups get more scientifically literate, you can expect that their engagement with the regulator and the companies is going to rise up in sophistication. Daniel and I, we serve on the pharma board. We've known each other for a long time. I didn't even realize, and I'll ask you a little bit later to give a little more precision about what your products actually are, because they literally require, they have the opportunity because of the interface between a drug and a device to provide continuous information about the experience of the patient. And believe me, the regulatory system is completely unprepared for this type of information. And how you deal with it, how it ends up in the label, how it gets disseminated, can companies even mention it? It's fantastically unknown territory and so important. And Sharon, I mean, the story, that whole, your story is amazing. You know, the college chaplain, nun, next thing you know, you're published on hundreds of academic papers and a serious major participant in this whole area from improbable beginnings, dealing with your own family experience as well. So it's a great group. It's a great group. What I thought I would do to try to bring some order to the chaos is maybe there are 3 topics we should kick off. And the 3 that I kind of thought could be good would be, first, to talk about the modern patient advocacy group, what it looks like today, and the role that you guys see yourself playing in drug discovery and development. Second, to bring in the other members, the other players, government, companies, in particular, and how they're interfacing with the drug development process. And then maybe we can end or mix in there specific examples, case studies of 2 things. One, how product development programs have been impacted by your participation. And also then how companies are reconfiguring themselves. And I think this is quite dynamic, because I asked all of you guys, what's an example of the modern interface between a company and patient advocacy groups? And I think it's a very fluid situation. So why don't we start with the first topic, and I'll ask Margaret to kick it off. And that topic is really what the modern patient advocacy group looks like, and it's how it's impacting drug development.
I think that you heard the beginnings of that discussion when Wendy was presenting and when Sharon was discussing her experience. I think when I spoke in the introduction about shattering the dynamic of how we're looking at the patient, I've been feeling it in an acute way, because it's sort of hitting a critical mass. Everybody talks about the patient. Every speaker talks about the patient. We have patients speaking about being patients. And, so I started to go, what's bugging me about this? And I was recalling, I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Frank Luntz, who does a lot of political communications. And Frank Luntz will tell you, it's not what you say, it's what people hear. So I'd like us to focus on a couple of points. One is the language that we're using around patient engagement. Are we going to get engaged? Are we going to give them a ring and say, okay, now we're engaged, now we're going to get to know each other, and we're going to, figure out a life together? There is no way to separate these worlds, and maybe that's what the modern patient, advocacy movement is today, is that we're everywhere, we're us, and there isn't an us and them. And I think for the pharmaceutical industry, for biotech companies, I was thinking about it last night, that you all have stakeholders, and I see Bob sitting in the back of the room. Bob has to go to meetings I meant to say shareholders and stakeholders. You have to go to meetings with your shareholders, and so do you. And I don't know what those meetings feel like, look like, but I think we need to start thinking of patients as the ultimate shareholder. So it's not just something you're doing that's nice for them, or that they need, or boy, they're going to be gratified about it. We have to do it, right? You have to do it for your business model. So to talk about what the modern sort of movement looks like, it looks like these disease foundations that Sharon described. If not you, who, right? Who's going to take charge of your disease if not you? We heard it in terms of the speaker this morning. So I think the excitement is, how do you integrate these different, sort of cultures and worlds? And, to be honest, I think we've come a long way. Everybody's aware of it today, but we have a ways to go. And some of it is language. That's probably the easy part. Some of it is changing our practices so that we are not just thinking about how do we engage someone, but how do we work together. So the benefit risk work is something that we can talk about. There's a panel right now that I'm sure is packed to the gills on reimbursement. That is a hot topic. I don't know if you saw the top of the fold today, the Washington Post talking about that Medicare data that they cracked open yesterday on physician reimbursement. Well, what did the reporters go to on day 2? They went to the cost of pharmaceuticals. Richard, you're familiar with the stories and the work, Wendy's been involved in this too, of patient disease foundations going to the FDA. And guess what? It's easier for the agency to open the door to have discussions and deliberations with that community than it is with a company who has a product under review. So I think the sooner that we can sort of knock some of this, maybe language issue or cultural issues down, the faster we're going to go. So at FasterCures, I'll close by saying we have a kind of a social media campaign called Time Equals Lives. And we struggled with it a bit. It was to show the patient story. I don't think we actually need to focus on that as much anymore. The patient stories are everywhere. We have them. Many of us could tell stories of them. But it's the time part. So how do we crunch the time so that we can get everything moving more quickly, so that it costs less, so that it's not as sort of exhaustive for a company to go through it. I mean, Richard, we were talking earlier, you all have a pretty significant product in an area in mental illness that is desperate for treatments. So how do we, pull together in a way and get more done?
There's a superficiality I find sometimes within pharmaceutical companies, biotech companies, about acknowledging the role of the patient. And that's obviously self-critical, but it's easy to say it, like you said, this idea of language, but how do you actually integrate that voice into the product development program? Because it's scary in many ways. It's hard enough to develop drugs. There's enough people at the table. So how do you bring in another disparate group? And so just to break the tyranny of the rank order of the table, Sharon, why don't you take it from here?
Sure. So to go to the question, my vision sort of the current patient advocacy organizations and the future, for one, I don't use the word patient because what people have told us is they're not patients, except for when they're sitting in that skimpy gown in front of the doctor feeling completely unempowered. So we don't use it. We say condition advocacy organizations or something else. There's no word for it. So I think Margaret brought up some great points about language. So we're not patient either as patients or patient. We're not wanting to be engaged, like either get married or get over it. It's like ridiculous, this language. And then I think the other thing that always struck me was in the early years, I would get invited to the table, and we have patients at the table. Well, we don't want to come to the dinner. We want to actually plan what city are we going to have it in, what are we going to eat, who else can come. We really want to be genuinely and authentically part of the experience. I think we see advocacy organizations over these years becoming more and more able to do research, to play in the research arena, to do all the kinds of nuts and bolts. Some have spun out actual organizations within the organization or even companies that are doing drug development. I think we're also seeing that because there are so many patient groups, disease advocacy organizations, that they're becoming a kind of industry on our own too, and I'm part of them, so I do want to keep this as a kind of we language. And we have to be careful that we don't become another industry, another cog, another problem in the sense of trying to emulate the industries that have gone before us. So we all know, and I think every single person on this panel will say, that drug development, the way it's been done, is not going to be successful moving forward. We know that. We can quote all the papers that have been written on it. And I think now the idea is for us all to step back and say, we can't continue in this pathway. I could tell you I'm successful because I have 140 peer-reviewed papers, but then don't I sound like an academic? I could tell you I'm successful because I have a clinical trial right now going on at Mount Sinai Hospital. I'm a co-investigator. But don't I sound like I'm gearing for the drug kind of development of the past? So what we need to do is say, if we risk as much as the people who have conditions and diseases who need us to risk, and really do envision the new future together, I don't think advocacy communities are going to look like they do today. I think parents of kids who are diagnosed today are going all over the place for their support. They don't sign up and send their check to the same organization they used to. They go to Facebook, they go to Twitter, they go wherever. So I think we advocacy organizations, and I'm sure my colleagues will talk about how the rest of the stakeholders need to change, but we're going to need to be much more facile, much more honest, much more bringing ourselves to the table rather than trying to emulate our brothers and sisters around us in an economy that really is broken.
One of the things you said to me that I thought was fascinating was the idea that this hierarchical view or the way you can distribute it in the different patient advocacy organizations, and that are in themselves disruptive, but the organization itself can start to, I think you said to me, they become the voice of the organization rather than the voice of the actual patient. And so the patients will abandon them as well and be insurgent underneath the patient advocacy organization. It's just fantastic stuff. Wendy.
You said something which is kind of going to get me on a little bit of my soapbox, which we talked about on the phone, and that is that we all have to change, and whether we want to or not, it's changing around us. And what I feel like needs to change perhaps the most in order to allow all these other things to happen is the old structures of how are we supposed to work together. And there's a very traditional dynamic inside of companies, and I'll pick on industry first and then go back to what you said, which I think is important, because I think we in the so-called patient advocacy world are also involved in this change. There's an old dynamic that's comfortable, which is, a little bit of a one-way conversation, a little bit of a late in the game conversation, a little bit of it's all about the access to the patient perhaps when we're getting close to market on something. And, then we care about this disease, and we have an internal staff structure whose job it is to interface with groups like mine. And by the way, in some companies, those are the absolute best people to work with, because they really are empowered inside their companies to touch all the important components, from research to commercial to marketing to everything in the continuum. And then there are some inside of companies, and I frankly don't blame the companies, it's just sort of the historical structure. And by the way, it's because people have gotten in trouble in the past for these interactions, and so there's a little bit of risk aversion. But I define them as they're either your internal champion and they're well connected inside the company and they are valued for what they do inside the business model of the company, or they're the gatekeepers and their job is to kind of keep you in a little box over here. And then we spend a lot of time figuring out how to work around that. And so I think that is a structural change that we can all help happen. And then I just want to pick up on what you said, which is I don't really like the words patient advocates either, because I don't really think it defines what we do. I mean, yes, we are every one of us is a patient advocate. I mean, nobody would be in this industry, this business of finding life-saving medicines if we weren't at our core advocates for what patients need. But really, I mean, we're funders of research, and we are very interested in the scientific discussions, and we're as interested in talking to people inside of companies who are working on the chemistry and the development of the molecule and the test as we are in the design of the trial, as we are ultimately in how that drug gets to market and gets to patients. And so I think, we have to figure out how to set ourselves up to be value added at those tables. So it's not just we're here because we're here and, count us as being here and check the box. But what are we bringing to those tables that's of value to the folks inside of industry who are trying so hard to be that patient advocate and bring something to patients and to respond to their shareholders? So.
Will you spend a second on the anecdote about your folks going to ASCO and
Sure.
interacting with FDA?
So we view our role as an honest broker in a whole variety of ways, within the science, within industry, within other foundations, and with government. And if you followed melanoma at all over the last couple years, you've seen that there's been just an incredible change in an explosion in a good way in terms of new promising things coming forward for patients. And the ASCO meeting, for better or worse, is a place where a lot of that is presented and discussed very formally and also informally. And for about the third year in a row at the ASCO meeting this year, there was incredible headlines on progress for melanoma patients, among other diseases. And we were distressed to find that because of lack of funding and other constraints that are placed on our government friends at the FDA, that there were very few, if not no, people from the FDA who are responsible for the regulatory decisions around these products who were actually there. Now, it's true they can read the journal articles and the posters, but there is just nothing like being with the clinician leads around the world who are seeing what's going on in patients and hearing the conversations and participating in those conversations to really understand what does this all mean, like being there. So 3 days after I came back from ASCO, I picked up the phone, or I emailed FDA, and I asked Dr. Pazder if we could come and meet. And I said, we would like to bring some of our clinical leads who presented some of this data to you. We understand that it's difficult for you and your team to get out. We'll come to you. And it was a full room at FDA, and an opportunity to really kind of try to provide some of the context and the color to the data. And it was a great moment. We had some incredible conversations about what's next, and they were so open to it and so thankful for it that we kind of decided we were going to institute this like on a twice yearly thing. So we did it again after our scientific retreat a few weeks ago, which happened to be here in this hotel, and they came to us because they could come that far. And so that was really great. The other thing is, and then I'll stop, I am amazed at how little contact the clinicians who are running these trials have with the regulators without the sponsors in the room. And I know, we're at an industry meeting, but I think that that is something that our organizations can help with. I think it is so important. And the clinicians are thrilled to have the chance to talk about what they're seeing on the front lines with the patients that they also advocate for. And they don't often get that opportunity unless they're brought there by a sponsor. And so that's a dynamic and a kind of conversation that we at MRA are planning to do more to foster.
Ironically, because of conflict of interest rules, they're not allowed to be in advisory committees and things like that. So there's all kinds of arcane reasons that impede natural flow of information between humans. We were at FDA yesterday, actually, on this topic, and your numbers are right. The FDA senior leadership told us that for ASCO, they were able to send 4 people.
It was because they were getting an award. I think you could only go if you were getting an award.
Yeah,
So note to self, always invite them, the people you want to be there, and give them an award.
And it's important for you to know, this is the policy of our government. This is the affirmative policy of the Department of Health and Human Services to prevent this from happening.
That's right.
And where it comes from is the famous GSA party in Las Vegas. So what happened was, these people said, a meeting is a meeting is a meeting is a meeting, a conference is a conference is a conference. These people want to go to the ASCO meeting because they want to have mind readers and have a good time. So NIH now, you have to tell them 6 months in advance when you're going to a meeting. There are 18,000 people at 27 different institutes at NIH, and there is a very short list of people who can go to these meetings. It is completely counterproductive, and yet it is what our government is doing. And so anything you all can do, I mean, we scream bloody murder about this, but their reaction to this is, oh, you guys just like to travel. Give me a break. It's just not understood how the scientific process works. And this is something that it's a big, big problem. Yeah. I just got to say a couple of things about this. This is a classic example of what NCATS does, and I want to give you. So this is a big problem. What we're talking about, how to engage patients. What are the best principles by which you do that? And I've actually put down a gauntlet at folks at our place to say that every project that NCATS does should have patients involved in the project from the very beginning.
Chris, just interrupt for a second. Tell people what NCATS does.
All right. So, well, our job is to work on the general problems that prevent translational efficiency. So I'll just give you just to give you a sense of boil this down, what exactly we're talking about. So in the preclinical space, it's unanticipated toxicity, it's unanticipated lack of efficacy, and business reasons de-risking, right? But everybody knows those are the big 3 reasons. In the clinical space, it's patient recruitment, it's diagnostic criteria, it's endpoint criteria, it's patient-reported outcomes, it's IRB harmonization, all these things that everybody deals with. It's nobody's problem in particular, everybody's problem in general, the tragedy of the commons problems. So nobody's really solved this problem. So those are the problems that we work on. One of the problems is, how do you take good examples of patient involvement and generalize it? How do you industrialize this? And what are the best practices? And we've actually struggled with this question of patients and versus people as well for a couple of reasons. One is that it's very clear that as these folks have said, particularly with the insights in genetics now, that everybody is a person and everybody is a patient. right? So it's just a question of whether you happen to be sick at that particular moment and are in a doctor's office. But most of us have diseases. I have 3, right? So I'm a patient, but I actually have Wendy's disease. Well, Wendy doesn't have the disease. I had what was a literally near-death experience with melanoma a number of years ago, but what's also clear is that if you look at the genetics of these disorders, that there are many pre-symptomatic people who are actually patients, but we still think of them as people, and so we're trying to break that down too. We haven't come up with a good word for it. What is it? Is it people engagement? Is it people advocacy? Then you sound like the People's Republic of China, and we haven't really come up with a good term for this. You would be interested that because this is so central to what we do, I actually asked Margaret and Merle Weinberg, who's sitting right there, who were both on our advisory council, to work on this question for us. So what should NCATS do to develop general principles by which you can involve patients? What kind of education is needed? How do you avoid the horror stories that can happen? We actually have a verb in our place. It's called being chimericsed, as of a couple of weeks ago. And we've had this happen to us. It's not just companies. It happened to us in a project too. The other way we're trying to think about this is just thinking of healthcare and drugs as a consumer good. And a family member of ours works for the Gap. And if you talk to them, they don't have this big technical issue that we get so enamored with. So we love our technologies, and we get sort of enamored of them for their own right, regardless of their utility for anybody who has a real disease. At places which are not so technical, like the clothing industry, the consumer is involved in design of a new pair of pants from the very beginning. They don't have a bunch of scientists that go away in a lab and secret IP and all this stuff, and then only then do they bring out these crazy pair of pants that are this long and this wide. They would never sell anything. It's crazy.
Well, a little of that happens to middle-aged women, but no.
Right. Well, there are exceptions.
That's how the genes look.
That's right.
That's another panel, Margaret.
That's another, right. So we're really trying but the difference is, of course, that everybody knows what a pair of pants are. Everybody knows pretty much how you make a pair of pants. But what we run into is that patients, or people who are now patients, often don't understand how a drug is made, how the regulatory system works, and unless they are educated consumers, they will cause mischief. And so that's one of the things we're trying to solve.
So we've deliberately kind of kept the industry finance toward the end of this discussion, because I wanted to get first seated with these ideas that are kicking around now. But I'll ask Daniel and Jonathan to talk from their perspective. Jonathan, why don't you start?
Sure. I'm not sure where to start. There's so many important themes that have come across here. I mean, one I wanted to pick up on as well is this notion of a bifurcation between patients and everybody else, which several people here have said, and rightly so, is not real. I mean, the way I like to think about it is we're all either patients suffering from a serious and life-threatening condition today, or we will be. And so when we think about it, and to Margaret's point, that the ultimate stakeholder in the room for what we all do in industry and the biopharma sector is the patient. I mean, that's absolutely right, and the ultimate stakeholder really is health. So maybe the language we ought to be using is advancing health, or something along those lines. But what we're really talking about is how we make that system work better. And I think what I have found striking as I've become involved in the debate and the discussion here in Washington about public policy as it affects our industry, really over the last 4 or 5 years, is how far we have come in the dialogue, which is the heart of the discussion we're having today, the recognition that we're all in this together and we all have to work together as an ecosystem. I think that we've probably already made that point so clear that we're sort of beating a dead horse about it, but it's striking because it's such a fundamental change from not that long ago.
But let me just interrupt you there, because I think it's easy to agree to it, but operationalizing that is the next level of it. I'm curious, like in your companies, in your world, are you beginning stratify or to create analytics around the idea of who's doing this poorly or well and how it advances the business.
Well, I think we need, if we want to sort of move the discussion to the business dimension, ultimately, we can say the patient is the ultimate stakeholder, and I think we all believe that. That's why we're all in this room. That's why we choose to be in this business and not in some other industry or in this part of this ecosystem. But we also have to recognize that, as Margaret said, each of the companies involved in this sector have shareholders, and they have to go into the meeting with their shareholders. And if you don't make the shareholders happy, you can't continue to do what we're all talking about trying to do here. Because and this is maybe some of the perspective I can bring as a venture capitalist, because it's very stark in the venture business. We go out and raise funds. We raise funds from investors to invest in something. I happen to be a venture capitalist who invests in biotech, so I go out and try and raise funds from investors to invest in discovering and developing new therapies and new medical technologies. But there are other funds out there that are out there raising money from investors to do social media or new communication widgets or oil and gas drilling or whatever it may be. And we are in a competitive environment for capital with all of those other industries and all those other areas. So as much as we'd like to believe that what we do is more noble somehow, and I actually happen to believe that it is, nonetheless, if we can't show the return on investment that's necessary, the investors will go elsewhere because they have a responsibility to. Their pension funds or endowments, where their responsibility and the way they're measured is on delivering the returns. And if we can't deliver the returns doing this, they'll take their money somewhere else. So when you step back and view this enterprise as a business, we have to be able to develop drugs and then market them in a way that delivers a return to investors. So that's the sort of, I look at the whole ecosystem through that lens and with that perspective, and maybe stepping back one step further. If you look at where all the money comes from that fuels this enterprise and fuels all the great things that we do, about 30 billion of it comes from the taxpayer in the form of NIH funding. And that's been flat for way too long. And I hope everyone in this room agrees that we need to find a way to grow that and grow that in a sustainable way. But that's about $30 billion of the enterprise. About $80 billion a year comes from investment in private biopharma R&D through pharma companies, biotech companies, and investment firms like mine. And then there's a piece of the money, of course, that comes from philanthropic sources that also is extremely important. But when you think about the scale of that 80 billion, we can't possibly do what we want to do as an enterprise if we can't continue to bring that capital and hopefully grow that capital, because at the end of the day, the more investments we make, the more we can bring forward through the pipeline to patients, and the fewer investments we make, the less we can do. So when you stop and think about it that way, it becomes at some level an economic equation around how much does it cost and how long does it take to bring these drugs through the pipeline, and what's the failure rate of doing so, which, as we all know, is sort of distressingly and astoundingly high and has been for a long time. But what are those dimensions, and then what's a drug worth to the company that has developed it when it gets to the other end? And so when you ask investors, and we did this in a survey that the National Venture Capital Association did about 3 or 4 years ago, when the industry was under tremendous pressure and the dollars flowing into venture capital funds that invest in life sciences was shrinking dramatically. And we went out and asked the question of venture capitalists, what is it in the environment that is causing this to happen, that's causing the capital to go elsewhere? And the two answers that rose to the top were, number one, the regulatory environment, and number two, reimbursement. And I think we're actually in the process of redoing that survey now, and I think that those two will have flipped, and people will put the reimbursement, that's just my guess, the reimbursement at the top. Still, regulatory is going to be extremely important. That's a function of this community having come together over the past several years, with FDA taking the lead in doing so, and addressed some of the problems, a lot of the problems that industry perceived in the regulatory environment. But the reason that regulatory and reimbursement will probably almost always be at the top of these lists is that regulatory is kind of a proxy for how much does it cost and how long does it take to develop a drug, and reimbursement is a proxy for what's the value of a medicine when you get it out there, and those are the two key dimensions to the economic equation. So I think when we debate how it is that we can drive greater success and a greater volume of important new medicines through the pipeline and to patients and do it faster, at some level it really comes down to focusing on these dimensions, at least as far as the attracting the $80 billion and growing the $80 billion that goes into doing it. We talk a lot about the regulatory environment, and maybe we can come back to that, but I'll just speak for a moment about reimbursement. And a major issue that we all face is how do we think about the value of new medicines, and how do we think about the price? And of course, there's a lot of debate about pricing, and there are those who allege that prices are too high and there's gouging going on, and sometimes prices are too high, and sometimes that is inappropriate. But in totality, if a simple equation, if you push down on the price, you'll reduce the return on investment and you'll get less of it. Now, that may be the right answer in some cases because you've got to be able to afford and provide access to people to the medicines when they get there. So all these things are competing values and competing forces. But I think there's got to be a recognition that that's a key lever in the economic equation that attracts investment into this sector or drives it away into other sectors. So how do we as a community articulate the value of drugs to society and to patients and to the community is an absolutely key question and a key element of all this. I do believe, and maybe one other theme to bring out on the table, is that the changes that have taken place over the last 5 years or so, I see, both on the regulatory front and increasingly on the reimbursement and payer side, as driving the kinds of innovation we do as an industry to areas of more serious and more significant unmet need. And I personally believe that is a very good thing, because it means that we're focusing our energies increasingly on developing drugs that really matter and really make a difference to the health of the people we're all trying to serve here. And those are the drugs that the system should be willing to pay for, and we should be able to articulate why they have value and why they should be paid for. And those are the kind of drugs that FDA is focusing on with the breakthrough therapies designation, and with a tremendous emphasis over the last several years of saying, how do we break down the barriers and rethink the development process in a way that can get these important drugs that really matter to people who are sick through the pipeline faster and more efficiently. And that of course cycles back into making this investment equation more favorable and brings more money into the process. So I think we have to continue to focus on how to increase and build on that virtuous circle that we've begun to create over the last several years.
So it's just a really critical perspective for you all to understand that when you build a company from scratch, like many of us have done, even though kind of emotionally the patient and the population that you're seeking to serve is at the center of the bullseye, when you go to that board meeting, it's a tough discussion with the venture capitalists and your public shareholders. We raised, in our company, for example, we probably raised $1 billion of capital before we ever made a dime. And $1 billion, and that doesn't come in one chunk, that comes in 1,000 chunks, 1,000 meetings, 10,000 meetings where you're talking to people, asking them to give you their money. And they're doing it only to make more money. And you try to you're kind of translating that money or transforming it into science and into goodness. But the coin of the realm is the coin of the realm, and you have to be sensitive to it. So that's why it's important to get Jonathan's perspective on that. Danielle, Dan, you've been patient, so
Just briefly.
No, I want you to take a little bit of time because
You don't want to do that. I can speak for a long, long time. But I want to add something that I think Wendy touched on thematically that I think is important here. And I'll use the term voice of the patient. Understand it's not perfectly adequate, but I think it describes at least the intent behind this. I think it's terribly important for us as an industry and as the ecosystem that tries to generate therapies that helps patients for two reasons. One is per se. I think Chris made a good point that Gap does not design a pair of pants unless having in mind the needs of the customer is going to wear those pants. So obviously our ability to capture what is the actual experience of a patient as we develop therapies for them and build it in a way that is going to best address their needs is pretty fundamental. But there's another reason why also I think it's critical that we engage well with patient advocacy groups and also the voice of the patient, even if mechanized through market research or through what we capture through clinical studies. And that's to address what I think is one of our greatest challenges as an industry. And I call it the asymmetry of expertise that is now becoming quite obvious between industry and academia and the regulators who have to assess those products also. And that's becoming a significant issue. Even Commissioner Hamburg made reference to it this morning. It's difficult to attract talent to the agency. And as our ability to innovate may be surpassing our ability to regulate and monitor, we have to find a solution to that. And there's something else you said, Wendy, that I think is very important. You go to ASCO, you go to a major medical meeting, I think we all go there, and I come back home, and I'm charged for two reasons. I get a bit smarter because I learned something, but more importantly, you walk away with what I think is so wonderful about our industry is the art of the possible. You walk away saying, there's things out there that can help those patients. There's a light at the end of a tunnel. There's technologies that we can deploy. And I think it's a big part of what motivates all of us. What's unfortunate in the fact that our colleagues at the FDA cannot attend those meetings is there's the bridge in expertise, and there's also that gap in the art of the possible. And I think the voice of the patient is key here to be part of that bridge and hopefully be the honest broker that can help address essentially what I think is a delta that's getting bigger and I think more and more of an issue in our ability to realize science.
Thank you. So,
but I can keep on talking.
what we can do, I mean, everyone's had a chance to kind of limber up, and the audience is welcome to come to the microphone as well. And I'll just encourage us all interject as we keep going, as we go into this discussion. Because a couple of things I'd like to talk about. Number one is, my view is that there has been a significant language issue between the patient groups and the FDA and companies that's rapidly changing. And the language was best exemplified by the example of an advisory committee at FDA for the approval of a new drug, where there would be a very intense regulatory and scientific discussion, and then there'd be a break and there'd be an open mic session. And the patient advocates would get up and they would speak in a language of emotion and desire and compassion in a room that's been speaking a language of law and regulatory science and data. And the two really didn't hear each other. And the common wisdom was that nothing that's said at the open mic matters, right? It only relates to what's inside the NDA. It's really a language problem, because both of the languages are valid, but they really weren't hearing each other. But now what I see is the patient groups are speaking the language of science and regulatory law. And that makes them very fierce participants in this. And my own contention is that I don't think FDA reviewers in Rockville or White Oak are going to have the luxury anymore of rejecting drugs that patients want, if they can interact with those regulators in the language of regulatory science and data. Moreover, as these organizations begin to develop more and more data, I mean, Sharon, you probably know more about your disease, your kid's disease, than anybody in the world. Cystic Fibrosis Foundation knows more about CF in kids in the US than the statistical reviewer in White Oak does. And I'm sure there are examples of that, Margaret, across different disease domains. But if somebody would just comment on that, is within the patient group, are you guys realizing you need to raise the bar in terms of your own capabilities in order to be more effective?
So yes, and I think that's a really important thing. That goes back to what I was saying, is that there's some onus on us, for sure, to bring value. And yes, we bring value in terms of the experience and the touch with the experience, but I think in those settings, you have to bring more than that, as you say. The emotion is really important, and the story is really important, but you have to bring an understanding of what the other stakeholders are dealing with. So you can't just go barreling in. I mean, some of that is good, but you have to have some sense of what their practical realities are, and you have to be solutions-oriented in terms of, how are we going to work through that? I mean, I can't just say to Chris, because he's at NIH, I just want you to do X, when NIH just can't do X. There's laws and stuff. You just can't do X. So I have to think about, how do I help him get to where we want to go that might be a different path. But you said something about working to get a drug approved. And I just want to say, I think it's a lot more than that, and I think it's a mindset that has to change to much earlier than that. It's about what's the development strategy, the why of the development, the what's the need, and everything leading up to the point where, I really don't think we're in a world anymore where it's just okay for the companies to only want to engage that patient voice when it's time to go to the ODAC or whatever. So it's the design of the trials. I mean, so many oncology patients, not enough, so many melanoma patients are getting their treatment in the clinical trial.
Well, you guys have to get more fierce than you are already on
So-
patient-reported outcomes, for example.
Well,
FDA
yes.
doesn't acknowledge these endpoints that
And
matter to you.
and the design of the trials, and I understand that the companies are trying to design trials so that they can get the data package, so they can get approval. And if the FDA is not going to be thinking about different endpoints, so I think there's a lot that we need to do, and that requires a tremendous sophistication, and it requires a real finger on the pulse of the clinical research community.
So let me comment on that. I'm listening to your comment, you guys have to get more fierce. So I think that's an example, though, where we all have to get more fierce, right? So it can't just be laid at the feet of these established organizations who are, kind of running and building the plane while they're flying it. I think an interesting example to look at today is the whole benefit risk topic that is part of PDUFA. And so, the FDA has been having their disease groups, their forums up at the FDA campus. I know that Sharon's working with pharma on, data collection. If you've not been to one of those meetings, I would encourage you to go for the reasons that you described. It's the open mic time. To the point where panelists can't even complete their formal testimony because they become so overwhelmed with the experience of what the diseases have done to them. And I think there is a real opportunity here to bring together all of the different sectors. And so FasterCures has convened an advisory council that includes industry, it includes academia, it includes patients. We don't feel putting FDA proper on it makes sense, but we've got former FDAers and we're sort of working in partnership with them to try to figure out where's the intersection point for companies to be able to know what to do with it. Because everybody's starting to work in their own silos again. I mean, if you go to a DIA meeting on benefit risk, companies are there. They're scribbling notes. They've got paradigms. They're working on it. But they're not necessarily talking to the patient representatives. So I think that's an interesting intersection. Going back to your point, though, about patients being fierce or people being fierce, this is a sort of an old but cherished example. If you look at the HIV/AIDS movement, that is an example of what Sharon talked about in terms of Sharon kind of speaking up at an early meeting and feeling like you got kind of pushed out of the room. Well, remember what the HIV/AIDS activists did? They didn't care. They were dying. And if you listen to some of our sort of most prominent disease foundation representatives, I'm thinking of a Kathy Giusti, she'll say, you don't really care if the Mayo Clinic's mad at you if you're pushing forward on something that's going to accelerate progress in your arena. So I think we all have to get a little bit more, fearless in what we're willing to do and say and shatter, and all of us need to mix it up a little bit more. It can't just be put at one sector's doorstep.
Oh, believe me, I didn't mean to imply that I think we all have. Within the companies, we're getting more fierce. Within pharma, within bio, we're trying to organize ourselves to get, and it's the right thing to do for the public health. It's not about just for the benefit of your own company. Often, the companies aren't the most credible spokesperson, right? So we rely on other people at the table to echo the themes that we're trying to bring forward. Sharon, you got a point?
Yeah, so exactly, I very much agree with Wendy and Margaret on both of these points. And the project that Margaret referred to, we're using the patient-focused drug development mandate of FDA to do more than they're doing at for example, the last one that we were both at was a sickle cell meeting, and to figure out how do we actually get the voice of the patient, and I'll use that term too without having something else, in a way that we can understand and in a way that's useful. So working with pharma through some support, we're using a platform that we've developed called Platform for Engaging Everyone Responsibly to see what are people actually experiencing. And we got 470% more responses than FDA did to its docket for sickle cell, for example. We got real nuances in whether people with certain genotypes had symptoms or not. We got real distinctions in age differences around living with the disease. We got information that backed up some of the things that FDA heard that day that surprised them, like fatigue is an important part of this disease, not just pain. We got overwhelming, 89% of individuals said fatigue, and 55% of carriers said fatigue. So it was really, really informative. It's a small pilot. We're doing idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis and inflammatory bowel disease next. But it's a good way, we think, to take kind of that bolus of emotion, those people who really want to say something, and give them the opportunity to do it on an iPad in their clinic or at home on their computer, all interactive, all in ways that they can protect their own data sharing, privacy protections. The other project that I'll mention quickly too is one that I think is on the radar of a lot of people these days, and that's PCORE-NET, which is part of PCORI, which is the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Network, and I'm on the executive committee, the steering committee, the governance committee, and I have a grant under that. And I'm in those committees all the time, it seems. But I think what's the opportunity there is it's patient-centered outcomes research. And so my project has 10 disease advocacy organizations working together under it. And we're right now talking about what is the common thing we're going to ask across those 10 diseases that will inform the FDA, that will inform drug makers, that will inform the NIH about their diseases so that we can work together around pathways, about systems biology, around de-risking, around finally giving, we all say in the patient community, we're like those AIDS people, we're like Kathy Giusti, we're willing to accept a lot more risk than the rest of the system seems willing to accept, but we say that, we don't have the data for it, and in this kind of an economy, we need the data, particularly when we go to the regulators. So that's the kind of stuff that we're looking for in these projects.
Go ahead, John.
So I just wanted to make a comment picking up on some of the themes here that have been mentioned about the benefit risk, and Margaret talked about how profound the impact of the voice of the patients has been at many of these FDA advisory committee meetings. I really believe that, excuse me, that framework of thinking about new drugs in the context of benefit and risk is at the heart of the profound change that's taken place in the way in which we talk about these things and the way in which we all work together as a community, including with FDA. And maybe one way to illustrate that is when you think about the user fee reauthorization process that we went through with PDUFA 5 in 2012, and Richard, you were right in the center of that with pharma and bio. That was, from my point of view, really a highly successful and almost cathartic process where all of the constituencies to this whole process of innovation in new drugs came together and recognized we need to think about it differently. And we need to not point fingers and say who's the enemy and who's doing things wrong, but work together to make it better, because nobody, frankly, coming into that process was happy with the way the system was working. Companies thought it took too long and cost too much and was unpredictable. FDA wasn't happy because they felt they didn't have all the tools they needed to be able to get new important therapies through the system fast enough, and they didn't have the public protection, and if they took too much risk, they get dragged in front of Congress and flogged for it, so that they felt like they were losing the debate at some level there. What we went through in the user fee reauthorization process was part of a real change in the way we talk about all of this. And we started talking about benefit and risk of new drugs and evaluating a new drug on the basis of benefit versus risk versus safety and efficacy. And if you think 5 years earlier, PDUFA 4 in 2007, when we all went through this process previously, the debate was about safety and efficacy. And the dialogue was kind of lost or drowned out by events like Vioxx, where industry was blamed for putting unsafe drugs on the market, and the regulators, FDA, was put into the box of being viewed as needing to protect the public from bad drugs, rather than work with the community to get good drugs that are so important to health out faster. So in 2007, excuse me, on the heels of Vioxx and Avandia and all sorts of other media kind of fiascos, we were losing the debate and having the wrong debate. I think now we're having the right debate, where we're focusing on the benefits of drugs and how to use science to develop them responsibly and efficiently in a manner that is financially viable for the industry and the patient groups, all the folks, the patient advocates at this table and out there in the community are now working with industry, and industry's working with the patient groups, recognizing we all have to frame this debate in terms of the benefits of new drugs rather than just safety and efficacy, which is a false paradigm. Then I just want to make a couple of observations about that concern me. One is the question of, well, I do think we're winning that debate today, how fragile that might be. And are we one Vioxx away from falling back into the spiral that we were in 2007, where everybody's pointing fingers and new science is not getting translated into drugs in the way that it needs to be as a result. And then I also want to point out in the regulatory domain, I really think we've had that debate and collectively had the right debate, and that's made so much difference. I'm not sure we're quite having the right debate and using the right language in the way we talk about the commercialization of new drugs and the reimbursement system, which is that other big issue that we talk about, and the value of new medicines. I think that in many quarters, innovation in medicine, in new medical products, is viewed as a contributor to the problem of healthcare cost. And that is a frame of reference that spells doom for our industry, because yes, new medicines cost money. They cost $1 billion to develop, we all know that, and then there has to be a return on that provided. But new medicines are also what has made such an enormous impact on human health and has the ability to transform disease, people who are sick, to provide better care. Now we need to solve the problem of cost and access and use the tools that we have in medicine today effectively within our healthcare system. But I don't think any of us want to be sitting here in 20 or 30 years without new tools, without better drugs to treat disease. So we have to reshape the debate that we're having in the whole realm of healthcare reform and payment and reimbursement to reflect the value of new medicines rather than new medicines and drug companies as a problem in the healthcare cost dimension.
Go ahead.
Just say a couple of brief things that come to mind because of this discussion. But perhaps it's because I come from the company that brought you Vioxx. Although I was gone by that time. The first is about the FDA point that Sharon made. I think where I see the FDA having trouble now is in actually connecting the left brain and the right brain. It's like the FDA has no corpus callosum. For those of you who aren't neurologists, that's the part that connects the two halves of your brain. And there are some people who do these wonderful patient-reported outcome things, and the sickle cell is a great example. But we are developing with a company in Boston a sickle cell drug right now, and the people on the review panel have no use for anything but the 6-minute walk test. And it doesn't matter how many times we beat our heads into the ground. There is no connection between this effort, which is fantastic and well-informed and driving the technology, and the people who are actually on the ground doing the reviews. And I know you're all aware of that. We're aware of that too, and I think that's really where the frontier is at the FDA now. The other thing which I just want to make sure everybody recognizes is the difficulty of the patient involvement piece is also the source of its strength. That is to say, if you think about the emotion that goes into this process, that emotion, I was taught in physics, is energy. And that energy can generate heat, or it can generate kinetic energy. That is to move something forward. And what we're all trying to do is have it generate kinetic energy, something that's going to move the process forward. The problem comes that given the phenotypic variability of these diseases, there are going to be patients who are so sick that they will have no interest, as we were talking about. I mean, Kathy said, could have been an example of this, but luckily got better because of Velcade and other things. But there are patients and parents who are so sick that they have no interest whatsoever in the regulatory review process. And they have a responsibility to themselves and their kids. We, however, have a responsibility to all patients, not one patient, but all patients. And then what happens, of course, is that the emotion gets channeled into the press, which the press loves, and stories in the press, which make all of us, FDA, companies, act in ways which are actually detrimental to getting the drugs developed in order to avoid that bad press. And you see it at FDA, you see it at NIH, you see it at companies, and we have got to solve that problem. And I'm relying on Margaret and Merle to solve that problem for us. But seriously, but it is, and we see this in one of the projects, another project that we're doing right now with another company, where the patients have threatened FDA to go public with skewering the FDA, and they're very well-connected people who come from the marketing industry. They know whereof they speak, and it's like dealing with the mafia. And they are being extorted, if I can use a strong word, into doing something they know is irresponsible. But in order to avoid being Vioxxed, if I can use another neologism. And so I just, perhaps you might think I'm in a kind of a funny place to be making these points as the person from NIH, but this, if you think about, this is the kind of thing that NCATS works on. And I think it's something we really have to recognize.
Can I just jump in on that? Because I was thinking about benefit risk, and I think about it a little bit differently. And I was going right where you went, which is the balance between the individual patient and the bringing a drug to market for a class of patients. And that tension lives within groups like ours, because we're founded by, made up by, peopled by individual circumstances that all feed into something that's trying to make it better for everybody in this class. And every one of us, in whatever disease state we're in, has confronted this very sick person or a family of a very sick person for whom the time that it's going to take between now progress and that drug being available for them is too long. Yep. And what I have seen in melanoma, so with all this incredible data, we were talking before we started about the anti-PD-1 and the next generation of immune therapies, not just for melanoma, but for lung cancer and for kidney cancer. And by the time we're done, maybe for all cancers, and who knows, maybe for other types of diseases as well. It's so exciting. And yet, as we know, these things take time, and we don't want to overpromise, we don't want to get out in front, and we don't want to miss the opportunity to get the data for the many, because we have dismantled the clinical trials infrastructure by making it available to those in need right now in an uncontrolled way. So what do you do? So again, it comes back to, I think, what a sophisticated organization like ours can do in that sense, because I have seen the FDA pointing at the companies and the companies pointing at the FDA. we're fine, we believe that there's a controlled way to do this, and from the FDA, and the company's saying, well, we would do this except if somebody dies. That's going to mean we won't get our drug package approved at the end of the day, 'cause it's going to skew the data. And I'm happy to say that, what we're seeing in melanoma, and this is just one example in the PD-1 space right now, where you have multiple companies kind of in a race to the top, which is really great for patients. You're starting to see some of these old problems get solved. And so we now have an expanded access program from one company in PD-1. It's not a free-for-all. It's not I'm on social media and I want this drug, so give it to me. It's a clinical trial, but it's an all-comers kind of thing. And by the way, they also are opening trials for those patients with metastatic brain mets who are the universally excluded from all the prior things. So there are solutions here. And I think the heat helps, but I also think that the sophistication of understanding why it's so important not to completely dismantle the clinical trials process, or we will never get to the point where we're bringing drugs to market and we're having return on investment so we can have more investment.
It's a critical point. And watch this space, because I think there's a lot of energy now within bio and pharma companies to figure out a way to do just what you're saying and satisfy all these various masters while preserving the integrity of the research endeavor. I'll tell you an anecdote, and hopefully it'll link into what we're talking about, and that is the man who founded our company in the late 80s had founded Centocor. His name was Michael Wall, one of the early pioneers in biotechnology. When he founded Centocor, it was about early in the 80s, about antibodies. It was really the first antibody company. And he has this famous quote he tells me all the time in Science magazine in the late 80s, where he said, Centocor is going to be different than all these other things. We're not going to have buildings full of regulatory people. And then he said, of course, 15 years later in Malvern, they had buildings full of regulatory people. Because as you actually are successful in the science to develop drugs, it's an incredibly regulated business. As a result, you end up looking like a pharma company. You have quality, and you have toxicology and pharmacology, and all the various things that, next thing you know, your org chart looks like every other org chart, because the law, the regulation, everything forces you into that box, which makes it difficult to adapt these organizations. And a company of our size, I think is a great kind of model to see about adaptation, but it's really a challenge to us within bio and pharma. And Bill, we talked about it yesterday. Bill Chin is here, who runs science and regulatory at pharma. We were talking yesterday about what's the right configuration of our collective teams to get the experience and the voice of the patient integrated into what we're doing. And it's not an easy answer, so it's easy to kind of punt it. But the challenge for us is that we have to figure out a way to modify what we do, because the orthodoxy will not prevail or be ideally suited. And it actually is a question for Chris in some ways, because you sit in this new entity, and I'm curious how the orthodoxy has accommodated using, because in the beginning, when this was first announced by Francis Collins, there was a lot of kind of reflexive response that we don't want this thing in the ecosystem. Yeah. But guess what? You're here. Yeah. And I'm curious how people are adapting.
Well, it's important to say, and as we talked about on the phone, we've been talking about how communication and language is really important in this space, and I'm here to tell you that the communication and language that was used when NCATS was announced was abysmal. And it actually got the message wrong. But I think it's a great example of what happens when an organization gets into a space that it hasn't traditionally been in. And Francis is a really smart guy. He's got really smart people in Building 1, but the language of what they said NCATS was going to do was simply wrong. It was simply incorrect. This whole idea that NCATS was going to be Pfizer on the Potomac on 1% of the budget was just stupid, and people pointed out that it was stupid. And there's a whole interesting backstory to why that happened. But and it's actually an interesting sort of, it ought to be like a Harvard Business School study or something. But what's happened over the last year and a half since I've become director is I've spent a lot of time, and Bill knows this because we've spent a lot of time with Bill and colleagues in pharma and folks at bio, and we met with Jonathan a couple of years ago too, as well as academics and patient groups, et cetera. And I got to tell you, everybody was mad. when NCATS started, because everybody felt like they were dissed and not paid attention to, or somebody was doing something stupid. As we talked about what we were actually going to do, which was to work on the general problems that affect everybody in this space, but nobody can work on them because everybody's trying to develop a drug or a therapy for their particular illness, and they have to do that, whether it's, Wendy has to solve melanoma, and you've got to solve schizophrenia, and everybody's got their own thing that they've got to solve. There's nobody working on these general solutions. So we work a lot on de-risking currently, undruggable targets, unattractive diseases, on technologies and approaches and paradigms which are then applicable across diseases. But the critical thing is that we don't do this alone. Every project NCATS does is a collaboration with somebody. And the reason for that is exactly what we were talking about before. We view people sometimes asking me, well, there's a cancer institute, and an eye institute, and a nose institute, and a skin institute, and a bone institute, and all that stuff, which there are at NIH. So what's your patient? Our patient is the system, is the translational system. And so we do experiments on that system, and the patient is sick in a variety of ways. And we know what those are. But then we partner with people who have a particular instantiation of that problem to demonstrate that this approach is going to be novel and of value to whoever that partner is. And then if it works, and so we have about 300 different collaborations with people from across the public sector, private sector, et cetera, and they bring us those problems. We can invest public sector dollars in de-risking those problems or establishing new paradigms because we don't have a short-term commercial imperative. You do. But then if those solutions work, they not only will move that project forward and hopefully result in a therapy which will help an underserved medical illness or condition, but also will tell us something about how to do the whole process better, and we disseminate that information. So I would say once it became clear that's what we're doing, that we are doing something which nobody else is doing, that is completely complementary to what everybody else is doing, and we're doing everything in collaboration with other members of the ecosystem, then people said, well, that's fantastic. Why didn't anybody say that before? And that's what brings me back to the communication part.
Well, I'm astonished to see that we're running out of time, so we'll take a question from Bill, but then I thought what we would do is maybe go in reverse order. It happens to be alpha, reverse alpha, so you get a break. And just tell us, you guys, what you need us to hear in the last few minutes, and then we'll wrap it up. Go ahead, Bill.
Richard, thank you, and panelists, thank you very much. I'm Bill Chin at Pharma. So if I could quickly summarize what you guys are saying, obviously the patient or the whatever term you would like to sort of cover with that, the voice of the patient, is exceedingly important. That patient has to be involved, not at the end, but at the beginning as a true partner in developing the medicines that the patients need. However, I also heard, and also that it takes a village, it takes an ecosystem in order to make this work. And perhaps in that, there's wisdom in that crowd that provides something new. But I also heard, actually from Sharon, okay, you said that we need to do probably something different. That we all have been working on this for a long, long time, and we are making progress. It's kind of slow, okay? If we're really impatient, we need urgency, we need to do more. So I'm going to go and just sort of ask the question, okay, so what do we learn from the patient? We learn about what the patient feels, what the patient needs. We need to incorporate that. We need to know how to measure that, to add on to things that are easier to measure, perhaps. But what do you think about the important role of patients telling us what causes diseases? I'm going to stop there for 1 second. What do patients tell us about their diseases? Patients can speak, talk about their diseases, but what do what do they, in terms of what's happening to them, in terms of the body, whether it's biochemistry, et cetera, what are the patients telling us? And are we capturing that? So I'm going to be ridiculous, Richard, for 1 second. Let's suppose that we are at war with disease. Some would say that's hyperbolic. But let's say we are. So if we are at war with disease, what might we do? We might conscript folks to be able to fight that war. We might conscript everybody, healthy or not. Because in fact, that's kind of fuzzy kind of separation. And that what we need is to get more information from these patients in order to ultimately learn about all the diseases that we're thinking about. So was that a comment or a question? I don't know.
Well, let's feel free to react to that,
Yeah.
or not. Oh, Sharon, go ahead.
Yeah, I strongly agree with that, Bill, and what it reminds me of is what I think about a lot, which is when we do have that sick kid, that sick person, that sick whatever in front of us, we remember why we're doing this. Every single one of us is doing it, no matter which sector we come from. And then when we get to the next meeting, stockholders, stakeholders, board meetings, steering committees, we forget. And I think we only forget because there's such inertia in the system, which is why I say it needs to change. I think we do need to understand what is disease telling us, what are people telling us. One of my favorite stories is a 6-minute walk test story when you talk to boys who have been given a drug and the drug is not working because they can't do their 6-minute walk test. What they tell you is, I wish the clinical endpoint was my fingers typing on my laptop because I can Facebook with my friends. That's a clinical endpoint that makes sense and people are trying to tell us something about, but regulators and drug companies, et cetera. So I think, and I'm going to wrap this right into your last point too, your last question, Richard, because I think it's really about each one of us, and this is going to sound maybe even preachy, and I don't go there at all anymore. I'm now a Buddhist, so it really is about every one of us. It's about remaining attached inside of our own self to that urgency and to our own truth, and saying to ourselves, you know, if I really wanted to make a difference, am I going to let the inertia of this meeting or this board or this whatever stop me? Because everybody else really wants to make that difference too. Nobody wants to have this, the way we're doing it now, continue. Nobody. So how can each one of us risk the way all the people who live with disease risk, and how can we remember that while we're working so that we do take those risks, we do say that thing that I think I shouldn't say, or move that rock that nobody wants to move, or paint that elephant that nobody wants to talk about. How do I do that every time? And if I don't, I'm inauthentic. So I think if each of us went to that, our own personal truth, and lived it, this whole thing would be amazingly different.
Not to trivialize any of these points, so much, in fact, to elevate them, and we just don't have a lot of time. So, what do we need to know?
Very quickly, I think patients are telling us, I want you to understand what I live every day, but I also want you to understand that as I live with that disease, I have also needs for information, needs for insight. I won't share a story I shared with you on the phone, Richard, but the tyranny of Bluetooth technology is becoming sort of a joke for us. In fact, we have the ability now, using drug device technology, to provide so much information to patients, to physicians, to payers around compliance and use of the product. The fact that it's available becomes an issue when it comes to commercial speech and pharmacovigilance with the FDA, because this technology does not fit the traditional view of the agency. That being said, when we talk to the agency, we find them that they are receptive and they want to change. So I guess my takeaway is, as we fold that in, that is the catalyst to change everything that needs to change. And I'm rather hopeful.
So I guess my two things are, I think that the patient organizations have changed, whatever we call them, have changed. And I think the sooner that the world and the other stakeholders figure that out and figure out how to better interact with that and extract value from that, the better off we will all be. And that includes that we ourselves have to present more value. And I also think that the other really important thing we didn't talk a lot about is, I wish we could look at the incentives in the system in a way to incentivize more cross-sector collaboration. A very practical point that I feel like we could solve some of these problems more if we were incentivizing that. And that goes from academia to industry to government to the nonprofit sector.
So I guess I would say, to the question, what's the importance of the voice of the patient and all this? At the end of the day, so many roles for it, but what it really comes down to for me is emphasizing the tremendous importance and value of innovation in medicine and of translating science into medicine because it treats and cures diseases which patients are suffering from. And when we keep that in focus, I think it helps to ensure that we can continue to win the debate that I talked about earlier, have the right debate and win the debate where we understand that drugs are about benefits and risks, and if you can appreciate which ones are providing real benefit to patients, then we understand the risks that we're taking and the uncertainties that we have to live with, and we can develop them most efficiently. And when we have a debate about the role of new medicines in the healthcare system and the cost of paying for them, if we keep the focus on which medicines are actually making a real difference to patients and how much value should we as a society be willing to put on that, it frames the whole discussion in the right way. So to me, that's the core of the importance of the voice of the patient.
So I would just make two final points. One is that I often say that to the folks who I talk to, and I said it this morning to a bunch of academic groups, that translation is an obligatorily team sport. And so, and one of the problems that we see is organizational and institutional self-interest gets in the way of that fact. And when that happens, because it is a fact, and when one player on the team decides that they're going to look at it after their own self-interest to the exclusion of others, that's when teams fail. And so we set up our organization, and I would encourage you to do too, if you think this is a good idea, to not have any projects which are homegrown. We do not do projects unless there is a partner. So it is impossible for us to get self-interested because they're not our projects. They're others' projects. And so, because we know human nature is like this. So that's point one. The second point is, another thing that I always say to our folks is, whenever you have and again, I encourage you to think about this, whenever you have a difficult problem and you're trying to figure out what is the right thing to do, imagine that you are a patient with a disease that you're talking about. What would you want? And when you put yourself in that position, my experience is the decisions often become quite straightforward, and they're almost always the right decision.
So I'm reflecting on several of the comments, and as a parent of an 11-year-old daughter, one of the tenets that my husband and I are trying to kind of impart to her is to be a helper. And I often will tell her, if you see a problem, whether it's now or later in life, you have a sort of moral obligation to step forward and be a problem solver. You can't walk away, you can't look away, you can't sort of, shy away. So I think that the discussion that we've just had, provides all of you opportunities to think about where can you be problem solvers. One of the things, Richard, that you talked about in terms of, what it takes to raise the money that your company needs to do its work, I don't understand what that world looks like. I haven't walked in your shoes, so I think the more of the knowledge exchange that we can figure out how to do, the better. Because whether it's learning from the patients and their experience, or learning what it's like to be in a room of shareholders, or learning what it's like to run an institute that can't, kind of get off the ground because we can't give it more money yet, we all have information that we need to be imparting to each other, and that's where I feel like exciting things have been happening. What Wendy was describing of getting the scientists and the clinicians in the room with the FDA, with the companies, that's where the joy happens, right? We all want the same thing. I just think that we're not taking the time to understand necessarily where we're coming from and what value we all have to add. I mean, you talk to scientists, and this was more kind of in vogue in the last 5 or so years. At NCI, they would host meetings where they would bring physical scientists in and mathematicians and all different thinkers, engineers. That's what we're talking about doing, right? It's not going to be one person who solves this problem. It's everyone with their different perspectives. And leaving on the note of the HIV/AIDS activists, that's what created that momentum. You had people who were impacted by the disease who not only did they have the expertise of living with it and experiencing it, affecting their world and their community, but they had ideas to bring to the table. And, guess what? Those ideas are things that we're still using today. So I think, anything's possible here. And what we've witnessed really in the last 5-10 years has been, very gratifying and transformational, but we have a lot more to do.
You guys are fantastic. Thank you. Please join me in thanking the panel.